Everybody back again, and I want to introduce Euan. Is it Adie or Adie?
It depends who you speak to.
Oh,
Adie is how I pronounce it, but everyone else says Adie. So.
All right, Euan Adie from Altmetric, who's going to tell us a little bit about influence on the web. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen. So what I've tried to do actually is modify my slides this morning based on what other people were talking about as well. Bit of an agile development type thing going on. I'm not completely sure it's going to work, but we'll give it a go. I know we've got time for questions at the end. We've got the discussion period as well, but I'm also quite happy if you just shout out questions, or if you want me to go into more detail about anything in particular, just go for that. So let's give you a bit of background. So my name's Euan Adie. I actually work for Digital Science, which is a spin-off, if you like, from Nature Publishing Group, based in London. And that's what my day job is. I work as a product manager there. But I also have a startup called Altmetric. And Altmetric is, as I said, it's focused on tracking the attention scholarly work gets online. So that's a bit of a formal way of saying that it goes out and it tracks what scientists and members of the public and patient advocates and all these different communities are saying about data sets, about papers, about books, this kind of thing. And that's really, I think, why I'm here. To do that, we use a lot of identifiers. And that's kind of the angle I'm coming at this topic from. It's as someone who's developing tools that uses these identifiers to actually let people measure influence. So Altmetric doesn't assign identifiers. Well, broadly speaking, doesn't assign public identifiers, but it does consume them and then use them to make it easier for people to work out, broadly speaking, who the top institutions or people are, or what's interesting to read. Some of the use cases that other people have talked about earlier on this morning. So in the talk, I want to touch on two things, and some may be more interesting than others. Again, just shout out if you want more detail about anything. But broadly speaking, the first thing I'm going to talk about is just the other identifiers. We've talked a lot about author IDs, and Greg went into, in the questions after, we talked a bit about institutional IDs as well. I just want to cover some of them. And that's because in the second part, I'll do some demos, specifically Altmetrics demos, because there's a couple of tools in this space. And some of the identifiers speak to that. They're useful for that kind of stuff. So the thing about metrics is really you need identifiers all the way down. So from a tools perspective, you may want, for example, to be able to give a funder some view about how the articles that they've eventually funded are doing, either by citations or, again, Altmetrics-y type stuff. But to do that, first of all, you need to identify who the funders are. Okay, fair enough, they're the people that have signed up to your site. But you need an identifier for the grants they've given out. How do you automatically identify them? Are you making them tell you, or is there some system where you can, for example, look up in ORCID, for example, all the grants that they've given out, for example? Who did those grants go to? And then what did those people who received the grants actually produce? What are the final scholarly outputs? And for the majority of cases, that's papers, but depending on the subject, it could also be conference proceedings, or it could be a book, or any number of other things. And it's exactly the same problem if you're trying to do something for a university. Universities at the very high level, we can talk about the university. Well, I'll come to a specific example, but the name of the university. But also within the university, sometimes they're interested in departments. They don't want to know just how's Harvard doing. They want to know how's the business school at the school level, or a particular department within that, how that's doing, and how that's comparing like for like other specific departments within other universities. And coming at it from an SSP perspective, publishers. If you want to start ranking publishers, how's MPG doing compared to Biomed Central when it comes to citations or attention, if you like, in a particular subject area? To do that, you need to know the journals, based on the articles. Where are those articles? Which journals are they in? and then who publishes those journals. You need to have a complete understanding, if you like, the full stack. And it seems like, for some of them anyway, we've already got solutions. Certainly ORCID, obviously hasn't rolled out yet, but it's very promising as an ID for individual researchers. And there's also obviously the Thomson researcher IDs. For journals, we've got things like ISSNs. I'll come back to that a little bit. And for articles, obviously there's DOIs. So really what I've tried to do here is mark ones that are going to be identifiers that are open and available for people who make tools. That's the perspective I'm coming at it from. And there are companies that do institutional IDs, for example, that track grants, funders, all this kind of thing. But it's not data that I can sit down and get to very quickly and easily. So the whole stack is important, like I said. And it becomes very obvious when you start building these metrics applications that you need to be able to, first of all, put things in content. So even if you are just dealing with people, for example, they need to say, we were talking about this outside in the break, you want to know what institution do they come from. If you know what institution, you want to know what department they come from, like what kind of reporting are people going to want to pull out of it later on. And when do you have to start thinking about that and dealing with it? And really, again, from building a product, what you need to care about is your customers, and what the customers want is something easy. So in the previous example of like a funder wanting to track stuff in their grants, the funder doesn't want to manually enter every grant they've awarded, especially if they're already doing that on 4 other systems. And they shouldn't have to. It's quite a reasonable assumption that if that data is public somewhere else, it should be available in such a way that other systems can reuse it. As we talked about, so ORCID obviously has come up quite a lot today. It's getting a lot of buzz. But that's not to say that these other identifiers aren't important necessarily. And also that some of the things that seem like a solved problem really aren't. It's not just a question of saying, yeah, we should do that, and then like people coming together in something like Crossref and then implementing it a certain way, like doing a half-hearted, not half-hearted, that's the wrong word, but implementing it only to a certain extent and not sort of pushing out as far as they could do. I'll come back to a specific example for that one later. So ISSNs, it's a good example of that. You think, well, to identify journals is pretty easy because you've got an ISSN. But yeah, so it's good that someone laughed there. So obviously that's not the case. So ISSNs, you could have a print ISSN, you could have an e-ISSN. You may, though in theory you're not meant to, you could have journals with 5 or 6 ISSNs, especially if they've shifted from publisher to publisher. And a good sort of way of scoping the problem, I guess, is if you think, so Google Scholar, let's say they have access to a large data set. They've got a lot of data from publishers just who want to be in the system. And even though this is in the Google Scholar FAQ, is explaining, I think this is the one for that journal ranking table that Greg showed before, points out that it's actually really difficult to disambiguate journal. So it's talking about PNAS and how there's 959 different ways of saying it. You can imagine, sometimes there's it's the acronym with the full stop, sometimes it's proceedings, sometimes it's, proceedings of the National Academies of Science, blah, blah, blah. So it's not a solved problem. And that was just, one of the ones that I have marked as being easy. So institutions, so it'd be good to maybe get some audience. If everyone in the audience knows about solutions for institutions and institutional IDs, it'd be good to hear it. As far as I can tell, it's a barren wasteland in terms of open identifiers for institutions. And the problem is not just that there's no, clear idea of what's out there, because it's not just a question of saying for Harvard, what is the ID? Ideally, you want to know what are all the institutions out there and be able to put things in context. But being able to map what publishers or the strings in the content to those IDs. So this is where even if I tomorrow came up with a completely arbitrary list of mappings, this university is ID 1, this one is ID 2, that's not enough. There needs to be buy-in from the rest of the ecosystem so that I don't have to have this big list. I extract this list of strings from however many papers, 7 different papers. So those are all different variations of Washington University, right? It's actually 5 different institutions. So one of them, this is a good example there, Washington University in St. Louis. In the string, that's the same one as Washington University, comma, St. Louis. But Washington University, comma, St. Louis is different to Washington University in Bellingham, Washington State. So I said it wasn't a solved problem. And a really good example of that is DOIs. So I don't know if I've got some history here. So, Crossref was founded in 2000. I mean, I think it's pretty safe to say the DOIs are the standard in STM publishing anyway, for articles again. I mean, again, this is all very generally. So you could say, what about preprints? What about data sets? What about microattribution? What about, should every figure within a paper be reachable by a DOI? They're all valid questions, but in general, the vast majority of articles published in STM today have a DOI. But that's not to say everyone uses them. So publishers have used them to a certain extent, but people don't deal with DOIs generally, users, especially online. What users deal with is links with URLs. And we've already discussed why URLs aren't brilliant. They're not persistent. Apart from anything else, any one paper could have dozens of different ways of getting to it, dozens of different URLs into the same paper. And there's a sort of classic example, or a classic way of showing the problem here, which is the problem's called Bugatea. So it's this guy, Duncan Hull, is where I first saw about it anyway. And he used a service called Conatea, which was a Nature Publishing Group product. It was a social bookmarking tool. It's kind of like EndNote or something, but it worked online and your bookmarks are public. Anyway, the point was that you had this bookmarklet on your web browser. You could visit an article page on any publisher. You could press the bookmarklet, and it would save the citation for that page into this central database. And what the central database tried to do was make sure that if you went to it later, it would tell you, 12 people also bookmarked this thing, and here's the other things they liked. The idea was to do some sort of collaborative filtering like Amazon, get some recommendations based on other people who bookmark the same content as you. I should point out it's not a Conatea specific problem, it's a problem with anything that collects links to papers. So this is a screenshot from the Mendeley search results. So there's 5 entries here. These are all the same paper. They all have the same DOI, but it's just not necessarily available to Mendeley in the same way. So one of them, I can't tell here because I don't have the links, but I'd imagine what it is one of them's a PDF, and the DOI isn't embedded in the PDF. One of them will be a PubMed record. For whatever reason, the DOI isn't in the PubMed record. I mean, maybe there's a delay between submitting the PubMed record and actually updating with DOI, and maybe that never happens. Who knows? One of them is maybe on a preprint server. Again, that metadata isn't available. So this is just a random example of paper. It's not that this one is a specific, a particularly difficult article to solve. This happens with all papers. So it's all fine until you try and do metrics with it. So, okay, how much of a problem is it? I go to I'm looking for a particular paper. I go to Mendeley, I type in a title, comes up with 5 hits. It's no big deal. Just click the first one. The end result is the same. I get access to that paper. But what happens if you want to start using the usage stats? So how many readers does that article have? Is it 394? Is it 6? I mean, that's quite a big difference, obviously. Is it all of them summed up? So that's obviously a problem. And I think part of what the problem is, and I also think is relevant to initiatives like ORCID, is that the reason it's happening is because there needs to be an incentive, first of all, to adopt these identifiers, but then people will only implement the identifiers up to the point where they get that incentive. And they don't necessarily take it as far as they should. So for DOIs, for example, there's an immediate benefit just to assigning a DOI and submitting the metadata to Crossref, which is that your cross-linking works in your references. right? So that's an immediate benefit to you as a publisher. All you need to do is assign a DOI, push some data in Crossref. You didn't need to put any metadata on pages. You didn't need to faff around with getting stuff in PDFs, any of that. You don't even need to show the user the DOI. You're already getting a big benefit. But then that's not enough for tools that you may not have thought about. So Mendeley or Conatia or some of the newer tools that I'm going to demo in a minute. You really need to sort of adopt best practices, if you like. And right up until 2009, in the case of DOIs, publishers really sucked at putting metadata in other places. And the reason, I think, was that there wasn't a very clear return on investment. There was no clear incentive to it. Until Google Scholar. And then for Google Scholar, you need to have the citation to be picked up. You need the citation metadata in the head, some very basic citation metadata. And suddenly everyone does it. So that's other identifiers and some of the problems with them. And now I think I'll speak a little bit about some of the tools. And I mean, particularly Altmetric, because obviously that's my background, but I'll cover some other ones too. And so as a bit of background, I said already kind of what Altmetric does, but effectively it's an aggregator. It tracks a whole bunch of social media services, of newspapers and magazines, and reference managers online as well. So the reference managers here are the public online ones. So I'm not talking about like EndNoteWeb or something. I'm talking about sites like or Mendeley, where part of the idea is that they're sort of open, if you like, or at least open to the extent that users want to share on them. And Altmetric collects mentions of papers in any of these services and then tries to aggregate them together to disambiguate the various IDs that I have, and then present them, provide analysis tools for customers who want to do things with them. So this is a very boring looking slide even to me, so I won't spend a lot of time on it, but how Altmetric uses identifiers is the two things it collects. It's not a very clear slide either. I can't find the super laser, but it collects URLs and user profiles, basically. That's the two things it likes to, it ingests. And the URLs, what it has to do with them is turn them into article IDs. So I said before, like with that defrosting the digital library paper, for example, there could be 11 URLs. They're all talking about the same paper. And for Altmetric purposes, thanks, Freddie. Yeah. So for Altmetric's purposes, it needs to collect all of that data into one place so it can say, this is a good metric for this paper. Regardless of how the metric is calculated, at least it is all of the things about that paper. On top of that, for some reasons that will become obvious during the demo, it needs to work out what journal that paper came from. And most of the time, it can get that from a publisher's website, but it also has to drop down to these other databases, Crossref, a lot of the time, but also things like PubMed or indeed SSRN or RepEc or wherever else has the canonical metadata for the article or preprint that's being talked about. Then the other half of it is a bit more like ORCID, where Altmetric needs to know where things are being talked about, but it also wants to know who's talking about them. And that's mainly, it's mostly to put things in context, but it's also to help calculate some scores and do some rankings, which I can talk about in more detail later. And at this point, what it does is uses services existing user IDs. So say someone tweets about a paper. So it'll collect the URL from that tweet. It'll also say, well, on Twitter, their user Stu. And it'll fetch their profile. And they'll be considered, in the Altmetric database, they're stored in a record where the ID is Twitter Stu. And all that stuff gets put together, and it produces records like these, which we'll see in a minute. Okay. So that was really how Altmetric does it. And do feel free to interrupt me if anything wasn't clear. But there are a whole bunch of tools that do similar things to Altmetric, rather. They're all in the field of Altmetrics. And Jason Preem's here. So Jason's the one that actually coined the term Altmetrics, and he's also one of the people behind Total Impact, which is a tool I'll show quickly, but I'm sure he'll be happy to give you a demo later if you want as well. And a lot of these tools, what the kind of pitch is if you're a researcher, come to us and we'll tell you, okay, there's citation counts, but there are some alternative metrics too. An alternative, I mean, I like the name obviously, hence Altmetric, but there is a caveat in that it's not necessarily saying these aren't alternatives to citations. It's not like you can suddenly stop using citation counts and only use these other metrics. That's not really what it's saying. But there is this other sort of activity that isn't being tracked but is actually quite interesting. And that's what some of these tools let you do, is find out what that activity is as it relates to your papers. And you could be an author. Most of the time you could be an author. You could also be a publisher or an institution or an academic society. So I'll try and do some demos. So the only thing is here that resolution is a bit rubbish. See how this works. It's not really enough. Okay. So this is Science Card. And this is a tool written by Martin Fenner. So Martin Fenner, I think I can't remember how he's involved in ORCID. I know he's heavily involved in it. But okay, so he knows a lot of stuff about this then. He's now working on article level metrics platform for PLOS, but he built this in his spare time. And the idea is that you go to it as an author. So I can't, unfortunately the login link's off screen here, but we'll just fake it. You log in actually with your Twitter ID, which is the same kind of authentication method as ORCID is talking about using. So it goes back to Twitter and says, this site wants to use your information, can it? And you say yes, and then it sends back your real name and things. Then what Martin's site does is it goes to Microsoft Academic Search, does a search for that person's name. Microsoft have done a lot of stuff about author disambiguation, so for some fields, for some people it works pretty well. So in Martin's case, it's returned these 29 journal articles. These are articles that Martin has written. He didn't enter any of this information. Microsoft Academic Search just returned it automatically, after, as a result of a free API call. There's a book chapter in there. And what Science Card does is it takes all of the identifiers that Microsoft Academic Search returned, and it looks them up in different places. So it's saying, for citations, in Academic Search, there's 311 citations of the papers that Martin's authored. There's 536 in Scopus. There's 290 coming from Crossref, yada yada. And also some of the sort of Altmetrics, if you like. So how many people have saved it on Mendeley? How many readers does he have on Mendeley? That's not a great number, but probably depends on the field. How many people bookmarked it in site alike? This kind of thing. So that's Science Card. Alright, so here's someone else with, this is download counts from PLOS. So depending on the different metrics available, it'll show you different things. I'll show you total impact. Again, so I'm not the best person to demo total impact. You should talk to Jason afterwards. But broadly speaking, it's the same kind of deal, given a set of identifiers. So presumably here, and again, Jason can talk about it, presumably here you could log in with your ORCID ID and it would pull back, automatically populate this list of things that you've worked on. But here you can enter some identifiers in the box, you can name it. So unfortunately the screen resolution is too small again, but I'll switch straight to this. And it gives you a report. Do you see that okay? So these are all the articles whose identifiers were entered. And then it searches across a whole bunch of different services to give you counts, effectively. So you can see, oh, okay, this paper was mentioned on Wikipedia. That's not something that would traditionally be reported, but maybe you're interested in it. Certainly you'd probably want to go to that Wikipedia page and see what the context is. It's been mentioned on the blog. You can see the number of views across different publishers in one place. This kind of thing. As I should say, by the other thing Total Impact does, which is it's not just necessarily papers. You can type in, you can do data sets and slides, and I think GitHub repositories as well. So then Altmetric is the other thing. I don't know how to get back to my... Yeah, okay, so I'll just stick to Altmetric. So that's been a little bit more from the author's perspective. So again, the resolution doesn't make it super easy, but if you're working on a slightly larger scale, so Altmetric is really, it's a services company. So what Altmetric sells is the raw data for publishers to put on their own sites. In fact, it does have a sort of standalone web app.
It's partly just for exploring the data, but also for if you're an editor, you're a press officer, you want to just see how your papers are doing in terms of attention. So this is the important thing. What Altmetric's collecting isn't anything to do with the quality of the paper. And I mean, arguably, citations isn't either, but the relationship is even weaker with the Altmetric score. What it's talking about is how much attention have your papers been getting? How many people are sharing it? How many people are talking about it on Twitter? They could be talking about it just saying, you know, oh, it's got a funny title, or this is a terrible paper, I can't believe it's got published. But it's still attention. It's still a link to paper, your paper, and people are going through to it. And we need to do a lot more work, just in Altmetric in general, to try and work out, you know, what all these numbers mean. But yeah, broadly. Attention. So here we go. Let me. So what I'm looking at here, this is the Altmetric Explorer, that analysis tool. What I'm looking at here is all of the articles mentioned in the past day, and all of the places that Altmetric collects. You know, there's that the social media news reference managers slide before, and they're ordered by the amount of attention they've received in the past day. So the top thing is this anarchist attack sign. So that's a Nature News piece, actually. It's not a great example. Yeah, let's do this one. Okay. So let's see what that paper is. Okay, this is an interesting one. So there's a paper about radiation in bluefin tuna. We can see, where is it? It's been tweeted by 59 people. News outlets mentioned it. It's been blogged by someone. Nobody's saved it to their reference managers yet. That could just be because it's a very new paper. It doesn't necessarily mean that nobody wants to. There's an illustration here of why just assigning a DOI isn't enough. So the reason it's saying that and not the paper title is because Altmetric can't get the title based on identifier, almost certainly because PNAS haven't deposited the record to Crossref yet, or at least at the point when it was picked up, the first mention. And if I click through, I can actually see the data. So who are the people that are talking about this paper? So maybe, unsurprisingly, given that it's about radiation and tuna in Japan, almost everyone's from Japan. So of the, 44 out of 90 people have tweeted it are in Japan. So what Altmetric tries to do is show you the raw data first of all. It's a story in New Scientist about it. It's a blog post about it. So there's tweets about it. But then also try and characterize that attention. And the way it can do that is because it's identifying all these people. You know, it's pulling in that profile and trying to identify them as people rather than just saying, you know, it is a string that mentions the paper. So it's managed to geolocate some of them. What it tries to do is, you can't really see it unfortunately because it's off the edge of the screen, but is to group people into scientist, member of the public, or a doctor, a practitioner, really. And it's a bit of a, you know, there's a lot of subjective analysis, if you like, especially when you come to things like, you know, how do you define a practitioner? So the idea is that some papers, if you write a paper that's really useful to a doctor in an ER, So you're not necessarily, even though it could be an awesome paper that lots of ER doctors read, you may not get the citation benefit you might expect than if it's an equivalently great paper in high energy physics or something. Just because that community don't necessarily assign credit in the same way, or the correlation isn't the same as in other fields. So the idea is that if you're tracking attention, there we go. If you're tracking attention, you can say, it's highly accessed, but the reason it is because 80% of the people talking about it are doctors, or quite often you'll see a paper that's popular, it gets a lot of attention, but for some weird reason, like what's a good one? So if it has there was a famous PLOS paper, right, about fellatio in bats. That's not necessarily not to disparage whoever authored it. I'm sure it is a good scientific paper, but the reason people were talking about it was because it had the words fellatio in bats in the title. It was like a funny paper lots of people shared. So what Altmetric's trying to do is to say, well, it did get all this attention, but 99% of the attention was from members of the public who never normally tweet about papers. Just to put in a bit of context. So that's the article level stuff, and then really where it gets more interesting, I think for publishers anyway, is to start collecting that. So I mentioned there's the journal identifiers, the difficulty of giving an article, what journal does it come from and who publishes that journal. So Altmetric tries to do that with existing identifiers, and it assigns its own as well where it can, to do rankings based on time. So this is a table of, again, it's only looking at in the past day, but in the past 24 hours, archive is the place that's getting the most attention. So it's had 283 articles mentioned. I won't go into details about the score, but Altmetric, rather than just saying, 10 people tweeted it, so it should have a score of 10, it tries to do some stuff where it identifies spammers, and it tries to reward quality as well as just quantity. Nature, Science, +1. Actually, these aren't super surprising. SSRN, there you go. I think it's 8th rather than 7th here in the past day. But so the idea here is that because we've managed to identify all these things and collect all the information in one place, we can do more accurate rankings. Regardless of what you might use those rankings for, at least we know that the same article isn't being counted like 5 different times. And that's pretty much it, unless anyone wants me to demo anything specifically or talk more about a particular area. I guess we could go.